Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Typically, I focus my shows on a single issue, but today I find myself with a difficult but happy problem. I have a guest and a co-host who are brilliant, original, and contrarian on a wide range of topics. Billionaire investor and author Ken Fisher started with $250 and built a $100 billion money management firm. And to get a clue as to why he's been so successful, look to some of his book's titles. The Only Three Questions That Still Count, Debunkery, and Markets Never Forget, but People Do. Also joining me today to co-host is author and economist John Tamny, old friend and many-time guest. He's director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks and is the editor of Real Clear Markets. John's contrarian book titles include The End of Work and Who Needs the Fed? So in a bit of a departure, we're going to have a wide range discussion on investing, philanthropy, Donald Trump, forced management, populism, and life success strategies. A bit more about Ken Fisher. Ken founded Fisher Investments in 1979, and as CEO built it into one of the world's largest money management firms. His Forbes Portfolio Strategy column was the longest continuously running column in the magazine's history. He pioneered the investment analysis tool called the price-to-sales ratio, which is now a core part of financial curriculum. Ken's principal hobbies are lumbering history and Western conifer tree science. And along the way, without really aiming at it, Ken joined the Forbes 400 list as the 200th richest American. Ken? John?
Thanks for having me here, Bill.
And John, I think you also pointed out he was the richest Forbes columnist.
Ken is easily the richest Forbes columnist in history, I think, right here. So,
well, you wrote a column.
Well, lots of superlatives, yeah.
All right. So let's start with the topic on everybody's mind all the time, everywhere, Donald Trump. We were talking before the show. I think he's misperceived by a lot of people when they think that the man that people see standing in front of the camera talking to a sports arena is the same guy that sits in the Oval Office. Ken, you've got some thoughts about that.
Well, it's not really thoughts, it's just observations. Trump has a quality that anyone that's actually kind of known him a little bit or more understands, which is that if he's in a group, like here today with us, just a few people, and we're just talking, he's a very different persona than the one you see if he's on television or in front of a big crowd doing one of his rallies or whatever. The person that you see in a private interaction, and everyone that I've ever known that's had these private interactions with him knows this, is a good listener, is well-behaved, asks great questions, and people like. I have watched him go from that environment of a few people in that conversation out the door to go see 300 people and like a light switch kind of put on the Donald act. And I can't really get inside of his head to understand how and why that happens, but when he walks back from that crowd, he then becomes again the person that's in the room. You interviewed
Steve Moore?
Steve Moore.
Yeah, Steve had that experience.
Has had that experience.
Yeah. He listens.
Yes, he listens, he asks questions, he's actually thoughtful. I like to say that in public he comes off as this kind of loutish character. And I don't know this to be true. This is an opinion, not a fact. I think that's a kind of a behavior that he believes works for him in politics.
Well, he lights up an arena, that's for sure. Well, I had that same experience. I was at a rally on the steps of the Capitol 3 years ago, 2015. Thousands of people around, and I knew him from my previous world of finance, and I brought up a topic, and all of a sudden, the thousands of people disappeared, and we had a very private and intimate conversation I mean, intimate. It was talking about a friend of ours who died recently, and he was very moving about that, totally taking everything that was surrounding us out of the frame and focusing just on the conversation. And then time to go on, click, bam, he's out there being the Donald. I don't know, John, what do you?
Well, I'd be curious along those lines. Was that your initial reaction to Trump? Did you read him as that right away, or did it take time to see? Oh yeah, here's the rhetoric, and then there are different results coming from that are actually very polar opposite to the rhetoric.
So my perceptions of him kind of precede the mass rhetoric. And my perceptions of him, and I tell this to people all the time, whether you love him or hate him, of which we got lots of people that do both, rather obviously, you're going to be better off yourself if you just ignore everything he says in public and only focus on what actually ends up happening. Mm-hmm. That is, what so many people want is a president to behave in what they consider traditional matters, in ways that presidents have behaved in the past. It's perfectly obvious that that's not who President Trump is, and isn't going to be. And so, if you take the sort of traditional Republican establishment gentlemanly behavior persona that was never supposed to call anyone else a name or any of those kinds of things, and you're looking for that, you're not going to get it.
Yeah.
And in reality, he's a form of an attack dog in public. And whether you take all the tweets, if you just ignore what he says in tweets and focus on what ends up happening, you're either going to like him or hate him based on that stuff. And I know this because he's told me this. He told me this before he was president, that if he ended up after 4 years having done things that most people thought of were good, he believed he'd be reelected. And he didn't define exactly what all those things were, but he said, if I end up doing things that after 4 years most people, they're going to forget about everything other than the good things. And my advice to people, whether you're somebody that likes his politics or dislikes his politics, whether you're liberal, whether you're conservative, whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, doesn't really matter. My advice to people is ignore the tweets, because 20 years from now, people aren't going to be paying attention to that much. And it doesn't really impact people's lives unless you want it to impact your life. And focus on what the outcomes are, because that's the part that really matters.
Well, as I think somebody wrote some time ago, his enemies, they take him literally, but not seriously. And the people support him take him seriously, but not literally. And so you push past the tweets.
I mostly agree with that. I think there's plenty of people that support him that say the following, and I think you know this to be true.
Yeah.
I wish he was like this instead of the way he is. And my point is, I think that's a waste of time wishing. Gingrich makes this point that he calls rabbits. I don't know if you've heard the Gingrich rabbit analogy. No. That Trump likes to throw out rabbits. And by that, what Gingrich means is Trump throws out a rabbit, and all those people that get excited are like hounds, and they can't stop themselves from chasing the rabbit, and they go down chasing the rabbit down the path. Well, that frees the president to go over here and do this, whatever it is. And that he does these things often intentionally or unintentionally, and I don't try to predict these things. He does these things to purposefully have the hounds go chase the rabbits. Now, that would include his perception of the media. That would include his perception of his opponents. If you'll pardon this phrase, he drives his opponents batshit crazy. And I believe he wants to. Because when you're batshit crazy, you're not as effective. You're worked up and you're emotional. But I don't believe, I may be wrong about this, but I don't believe AOC could be the attention grabber, and that the Democrats could go as far to the left as they've been going if it were not for him driving them to believe that whatever they do doesn't matter because of the perception of the extremity of him. I believe that's a tool that he believes works to his advantage.
Well, and he also, I think he uses the tweets strategically to change the subject. There'll be a media rage over a particular topic one day, and then he tweets something else, and then they go running off to pursue the new
Bill,
outrage.
Let's think about that a different way. So I don't know that he has any particularly accurate way to do that, and he might do it well sometimes and not well other times.
Mm-hmm.
And if you believe that, which I believe, that it's kind of like that Newt Gingrich rabbit thing, then you say to yourself, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I don't try to predict that. I don't think there's any way to know that. He is a unique phenomena to date in American politics. I find it fascinating that when you actually think of the 2018 midterms, that we haven't actually seen other major candidates attempting to emulate any of his tactics. The big rallies, the social media, the way he did them. I mean, his 2016 campaign had a lot of unconventional features that worked, and people don't much talk about those. The last 72 hours in Michigan were, for him, a breathtaking event, set of events, I should say. And nobody anticipates those things. And I don't see anybody else imitate those things. I find it fascinating that nobody imitates. And I go back to this point that I've said to John, which is that humans are slow to learn. And Trump's modality is sort of a new modality on the political scene in America in terms of strategy and tactics. And campaign managers and what have you are still kind of stuck in their ways. He's had some big successes in campaign activities that people still don't kind of say, gee, I wonder if I should try to do that one there. I bet I could do that.
Well, that's stylistically true, but it's also hard to imagine anybody else getting away or doing what he does. He's 10 years, 15 years on the reality TV show gives you a certain touch that most politicians lack.
There are a lot of people that have got the celebrity from TV and couldn't pull off that stuff.
Well, that's true. But they also didn't build Trump Tower, so he's got those two things going. Yeah, John?
What if Trump had run on a platform, you're getting robbed by that dollar that the U.S. Treasury is constantly weakening. Your paychecks don't stretch as far because they've got tariffs on certain goods. These regulations, you're asking the untalented to police these businesses. My question is, if he had run with his personality as a libertarian, do you think he still wins? Did the personality win or did the policies win, I guess is my question.
I personally believe he did a very good job in 2016 of saying, here are some issues where I can get people to be excited about that people before didn't much get excited about. And those people didn't go and vote. And I can appeal. But a lot of his tactics were just brilliant. I mean, the part where in rallies he would get people to take a picture and do social media to 30 of their friends. And you get 30,000 people there, and they communicate to 30 of their friends. That's better than being on any TV show.
What's your sense of how deep his beliefs run? I don't know. I was in the camp that thought that he'd picked up the conservative playbook talking points and maybe some of the social conservative talking points, for example, abortion or whatever, and was using those to get elected, but we weren't sure what would happen after he won, whether he'd stay on those policies. And it turns out he has, and he's brought about all the things that he said, not all, but a lot of the things he said he was going to do.
I never try to predict him. I don't believe I have any capability to predict him. I believe I have an ability to observe what actually ends up happening. And that's why I don't get carried away with trying to take a tweet and then from that extrapolate to an action, because I just don't believe there's anything there.
Well, we were trying to predict him, and most of us weren't sure whether he was going to follow through, and he has. So I think that's something that's going to work for him in 2020.
Well, surely that's true in this way. If you
Yeah.
just think through the 2016 campaign, there was almost no one in Congress that supported him. They were all, absolutely of the view that he was going to be a down-ticket disaster.
Yeah.
And in fact, he was not a down-ticket disaster in 2016. And in fact, now lots of them, because of exactly what you said, Bill, most of them do support him. So he has support bases he didn't used to have. The question that you have to wonder when you look at 2020 in a different way, and I don't know the answer to this, is those that kind of never voted for anybody because they didn't really see a candidate that mattered to them but voted for him, do they still feel that way truly? And I don't believe you can measure that correctly. We won't find that out until 2020.
No, that's true.
I
In terms of our world, which is the investing world, I believe he's been good for markets, good for business, good for investing. What's your view?
So people, in my opinion, always want to put too much blame or credit on presidents. I don't believe presidents are as important as people think they are. Do I believe they're unimportant? No. But do I believe they're as important as most people think they are? The way I view investing kind of starts with a global top-down view. I don't believe that America, as 23% of global GDP, really can go a different direction from the rest of the world. And I believe the world tends to go in a direction, and I tend to think of almost all things global first, and that America, the biggest and the best country, still fits into that puzzle. So do I think things are going pretty darn well? Yes, but for example, there's way too much focus on things like the U.S. Central Bank without actually getting the concept that the U.S. Central Bank is a player in a global monetary world, and that it's the global monetary world that really matters, not so much the Fed. That the Fed's a player, but it's a secondary player to the global totality. And I think people miss that. They want to put too much emphasis on the president for good or for bad.
Well, the president does. There's monetary policy you just mentioned. There's fiscal policy, tax, regulation, so on and so forth. He's done some good things on taxes, not small steps, not something large. Regulation, he's chipping away at. He's appointed some good judges that would be supportive of market.
If you are a conservative, the main thing you're really going to like is his judicial picks and his success with the judicial picks. Mm-hmm. Part of which was set up by Chuck Schumer, of course.
Well, he helped we got rid of the nuclear option.
Yep.
Yeah.
Without Chuck Schumer's help, Mitch McConnell couldn't have done what Mitch McConnell's done. And that was, of course, unintentional. But the reality is, at this point in time, when you look at the federal benches, there's never been this high a percentage of replacement by any president ever. And most conservatives would say that the picks have been pretty darn good.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think he's done something else.
Which lasts a long time.
I think just the rhetorical leadership he's provided for the private sector, for the business community, for entrepreneurs has been terrific.
Let me
because we went through 8 years where entrepreneurs were told you didn't build that.
Yeah, but let me argue against the benefit of the president in that regard. An awful lot, not all, but an awful lot of what you believe the president's done that's good, the next president can just as quickly undo, assuming that he has a little bit of help from Congress. But if we get a president that wants to go the other way, all of the executive order stuff and what have you goes back the other direction if they want to, if that president wants to. This president's done things that a conservative would like, many of which, let me describe.
It cuts both ways.
Well,
Yeah,
but what you're I agree. I mean, I think Richard Nixon said the problem with politics is there's no permanent victory. Is that you win one election, then you got to go right back and fight the next one. It can be undone. But
let's say you're a conservative, and you hoped that the president would effectively drain the swamp, a campaign discussion. If you think about it, the way I would envision a swamp, and I actually had this conversation with John back in the day, if you got a swamp and you want to drain it, you need to bore in some big holes with screens so they don't clog up. And you can't actually see what those holes are that have been drained. If you're a conservative, what I said, which hasn't, that if Trump was to actually drain the swamp, and of course you don't hear that talk, drain the swamp, much anymore, but if the president was to actually drain the swamp, he needed to take a few big categories and make some big holes in that swamp and let a lot of water go out. And in fact, we haven't really seen that big action.
Well, that's the problem with metaphors. I mean, you can describe this place as a swamp, and then you dig into it. What's that really mean? Somebody explained to me that if you want to think about what the swamp is, think about that couple you know that lives in Arlington, and she works for the EPA, and he works for the Justice Department. They've got 3 kids. They're kids in Little League baseball, and they're nice people. That's the swamp. And you've got hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people depending on this thing. There are all these human relationships that are not going to get changed. And I don't know where you drill the hole. It's very hard to do that.
So the way you would drill the hole is when he had both chambers of Congress, you would have passed legislation and signed it that said, I'm making this up, we take Department X and we gut their budget by, this big number, right? You pick where you want to bore the hole. That's not my issue. But we're going to take the department of such and such and take it from X down to 20% of X. And we're going to do it right now, right here. And in fact, you don't see any of that. But let me go back to, and I usually don't like to be very critical of people very directly, unless they're a politician or a convicted felon, of which we have plenty to choose from. But Peggy Noonan wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal in the last month that I just thought was one of the dumbest pieces that I've seen. And I don't say that lightly. This is this one where she wrote how there's all these old sort of barons of, did you see this piece?
Yeah.
The old barons of...
Sarah, my wife, is off camera, and she exploded when she read that. That was just the dumbest article ever.
And he had this opportunity to win over the old barons of Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah.
And you sit there and you say to yourself, how do you win over the old barons of Washington, D.C. and hope to claim continuity of a base that sent you to D.C. to drain the swamp?
Yeah.
Because those people are inherently, she describes sort of the former retireds, 80-year-olds, hanging around having lunch in their clubs and at designated restaurants. And he's, why do you need to win them over, number one? And number two, if you won them over, the things you'd have to do to win them over would disenfranchise that Harley-Davidson motorcycle rider that never voted for anybody before but came out of the woodwork in 2016 to vote for Donald Trump.
He would have captured the Jeb Bush vote.
Yeah,
or maybe the
exactly.
Mitt Romney vote.
Exactly.
About 35, 40%, if that.
Something like that. Something like
that
that. But
Yeah, I wanted to interview her in response and say, please name me these people who are talking about Zbig at the club. It was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever read, and it was wholly counter to what Trump was supposed to be about. Which leads to me. Here's okay.
But if you go back to Bill's point, John, the man gets elected, and a lot of people said we don't really know what he's about. So maybe he is going to be about trying to do that or some other thing. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, I go back to, if you're looking at 2020, he's got to put together, he can get new voters he didn't have before or not, but he is going to have a harder time if he loses those voters that he had before. And all of everything you read about him says that he's done a pretty good job of holding on to his base even when he's not popular. Mm-hmm. But you win over it's really hard, in my opinion, to win over the people Peggy Noonan was talking about in that article and hold on to your base.
And you're not going to. I once explained it to a writer who said, I want to convince people on the left. And I said, if North Korea versus South Korea doesn't convince you, don't think that this op-ed you're writing right now is going to change the debate. You're trying to win over the people maybe on the edge, but you're not going to win over the extremes. And he wasn't going to win over these people who talk about Zbigniew Brzezinski. It was just the most ridiculous thing. It just leads to my one question. Two businessmen right here. I always had a problem back in the Obama years. Well, Obama doesn't like business enough. And my reaction was, well, it's not the president's job to like business. And it kind of getting to your point, I'm concerned. This cuts both ways. All this executive power, all this deregulation, Trump's doing this, Trump's doing that. I'm a bit terrified. He's not president. There will come a day when someone is like him who has the exact opposite view. And are we setting ourselves up for some unhappiness based on, or is he sui generis?
I don't know the answer to your question, John. I mean, I got a great answer for it. Maybe. The reality of most politicians traditionally is they're not very original, and everyone knows that. And will there be a Democrat who is able to go there? Most of the time, the people that appear out of nowhere, like a Ms. AOC, are going to flame out long before they ever get to that level.
I think of her as the Sarah Palin of the left.
I don't.
She was the
no.
darling. Sarah Palin, remember when she came out, Charles Murray said just he's deeply in love, and she took everybody, and then it disappeared.
I don't have a prediction for any one person, but generally most of these people that pop
Sure.
up out of nowhere, before they could ever get to that level, they flamed out. And as a general rule, if you had to be playing stats, you'd say it takes a very, I mean, just, there is no question any way you define it that Trump has been unusual. He's the first guy that's ever elected president that wasn't a military guy or previously a long-term elected politician. A guy runs for office out of nowhere and wins. Does it being outspent 2-1. If you just put kind of those numbers in front of people, people would say, that'll never happen. And that's what they did say. That'll never happen. So it would take someone, I think, on the other side, which might happen, that's pretty unusual. Could that happen? Absolutely. I mean, you know, what people fear from the right or from the left is sort of the rise of a future rightist or leftist Adolf Hitler. That's the fear that Nancy Pelosi is trying to inspire this last week when she says that if he loses the election in 2020, he won't leave office. That you're trying to, the end of democracy as we know it, the end of our civilization, the rise of a conservative Hitler. But the reality of getting someone to be unusual enough to do that's pretty unusual. And I just don't know the answer. I just don't know. You know, you have to hope. I go back to the prior point that I said to you before, Bill, about this. My advice to people always, and I say this to liberals and I say this to conservatives, is ignore things that he says and focus on what the outcomes are. Now, if you're a liberal, you're not going to like an awful lot of the outcomes that we've had. If you're a conservative, you will. But what the liberal, if the liberal wants to prevail, in my opinion, most successfully should do, is focus on building a base that doesn't like those outcomes, as opposed to getting wild and crazy about the tweets. Because literally, people don't pay too much attention to last year's tweets. It kind of goes out with the newspaper and the old fish, and they pay attention to the new tweets. As we speak today, which may not be tomorrow, Trump's popularity levels are at 46%, his approval ratings. If his approval ratings are at 46%, as I said in my Financial Times column of July 9th, 2016, he'll lose the popular vote, but he'll get reelected. I mean, if as happened last time, as I depicted in that column in the Financial Times, if he loses the popular vote by 3%, he will get reelected President of the United States. That's just the way the math of the Electoral College works. That's the reason that liberals hate the Electoral College so much, because it gives all of these places that are low population density states lots of excess power. It's the same reason we have 2 senators from Wyoming. It's the same reason that California wouldn't like the notion we have 2 senators from Wyoming.
Well, my view, John, to answer your question is, well, who knows? We're going to get somebody that's somebody, but I'd rather have a continuation of what we're doing now on the policy front and just hope for the best. We're not going to end up with the libertarian dream of of a 19th century, 18th century limited constitution government. So we got to work with what we got. And I think I do think a president matters in the sense that he sets the tone for the country. And if you're a businessman and you're making decisions about allocating capital or doing something new, and you got somebody like an Obama who's saying you didn't build that and who's changing the regulations. I mean, one of the things that's so bad about regulation is not just the fact of it, because entrepreneurs can work in a regulatory framework if you just hold it steady. But what was happening was it was changing every week, every month. You got tax policy changing. And so if you're allocating capital, you don't know what the world's going to look like.
I'm a bigger believer than most in stock market.
Yeah.
And in its being more rational than most people think it is, because most people just think it's crazy. Not perfectly rational, but more rational than most people think. If you look at the history of the S&P 500, which goes back in a backdated sense to 1926, with only a few exceptions, 6 of them, all of the negative years are in the first 2 years of president's terms, which are negative about half the time. And if you look at the history of American legislation, most all of the big legislation goes through in those first 2 years because the president knows when he gets elected that his party is most likely, a la 2018, to lose relative power to the opposition party in the midterms. So whatever would be the toughest legislation for him to get through, if he doesn't get it done in his first 2 years, he'll never get it done in his back 2 years. So big legislation goes through, whether it's Hillary Clinton trying to get nationalized health care in 1993, or whether it's the Affordable Care Act finally, or whether it's Dodd-Frank. All of these happen in the first 2 years of president's terms. They don't happen in years 3 and 4. And the way I depict that is that big legislation, going back to your point, is like all of life is a little bit like you're going through an obstacle course. But big legislation is like going through an obstacle course with big, sharp, fast-moving, swinging obstacles.
Right.
And the lack of legislation is like the obstacle course with the stationary obstacles. Which would you prefer? Somebody who will take risk much prefers the stationary obstacles, which is the lack of change in legislation, which is why markets, which tend to pre-price, have those negative first and second years, because they actually know that that risk of big stuff is coming. And I think it's a perfect example of what you said, but I don't think it's uniform throughout the 4 years. The talk that a president may give, whether it's President Obama or President Trump, is one that, well, I'll give you a landmark moment in my life, which was after Bill Clinton had promised a middle-class tax cut in 92, and then became president and said, I got to change course and increase taxes. And then they did, income taxes. I said to myself, I don't have to pay that tax. All I got to do is make sure I don't make any income. There ain't no tax. And how do I do that? Well, I get a fat gross margin and I spend everything below the gross operating profit line on growth, which is the exact same thing Amazon's done. It's the exact same thing Salesforce.com's done. And you sit there and you say, this way I don't pay any income tax and I can outweight this. And people could outweight Barack Obama. And my point to you, if you like or dislike President Trump, is people can outweight President Trump. That's if you like him, that's the bad news. If you don't like him, that's the good news. And the reality is, if you've got a view to build a business, you said if you build this business, Obama made that point, you didn't build this business?
Right.
Well, despite that, if you got the business and it's yours, you can outweight whatever president you got. What comes next, I don't know, but you can outweight that one.
We've got to wind this up. This has been so interesting. I'm so
Thank you for
delighted
having
you're
me,
here.
Bill.
Yeah,
It was
this
fun.
is very interesting. And
You've got a great place here, a great thing you're doing.
yeah, well, I'm trying to bring interesting people into the world, and you are one of the most interesting people I've met. John, any final thoughts here?
You've
been a
rendered
witness
me
to the
speechless
prosecution.
Because as anyone who's watched me on the show before, I always want to talk. But when Ken's here, I just like to listen. I learned so much. So I'm just glad to have been a part of this one.
Okay, Ken, thank you.
Thank
It's been
you.
fantastic, and hope we'll have you back on because I think we could continue this for a while.
It'd be great.
Great. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.